Throughout Eastern Europe, millions vowed to build the communist paradise. They toiled to carry out orders and plans dictated from Moscow. They marched behind the banners of Joseph Stalin. March 1953. The Soviet Union mourns the death of Stalin. For almost 3 decades, Stalin ruled supreme. How would they manage without him?
It felt as if the whole world was about to collapse. We wondered what was going to happen to us. We thought of Stalin as our father who would always look after us.
Stalin died without naming a successor. A collective leadership emerged, led by Georgy Malenkov, Lavrenti Beria, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Nikita Khrushchev. Millions of Russians grieved for their dead leader, even though his rule had been ruthless and their own welfare neglected. Stalin had transformed the Soviet Union into a superpower, but at his death, relations with America and the West had seldom been worse.
For 10 years, the world has been dominated by the malignant power of Stalin. A new era begins, an era in which the guiding spirit is liberty, not enslavement, and when human relations will be those of fraternity, not one-man domination.
America, too, had a new leadership. President Eisenhower, Secretary of State Dulles, and Vice President Nixon pledged that they would roll back the frontiers of Soviet power. Eisenhower and Dulles had accused the Truman administration of being soft on communism. Now they had the opportunity to challenge Soviet power. But could Eastern Europe be freed from Soviet domination without a nuclear war?
Dulles had talked about liberation, but Eisenhower had insisted that he do so, that when he did so, he coupled it with by peaceful means. And so it is not at all obvious how liberation in the sense of rollback could be achieved merely by peaceful means.
The Soviet Empire extended across Europe into Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and into East Germany, which called itself the German Democratic Republic. Stalin had chosen Walter Ulbricht as the ruler of East Germany. He headed a regime servile to Moscow. After Stalin's death, Ulbricht pressed on, rebuilding his part of Germany along Stalinist lines.
Und unsere Straße veränderte ihr Gesicht. Wo vor Monaten noch Ruinen standen, waren Konstrukteure, Maurer und Zimmerleute an der Arbeit.
Heavy industry was built up to meet the demands of the Soviet economy. Workers were ordered to increase their output. Everyday needs were neglected.
Die Normalbevölkerung lebte.
The average person lived very badly.
Die Versorgungslage war teilweise katastrophal.
If you're talking about the things everybody needs, like heating, coal, electricity, these things were all rationed.
Für Feuerung, Kohlen beispielsweise. Dann tägliche
Electricity for domestic use was simply not available.
War also nicht genügend Elektrizität vorhanden.
The morale of the population dropped to zero.
Die Moral der Bevölkerung war, ich würde sagen, unter Nullpunkt.
Like Stalin, Ulbricht tolerated no opposition. The secret police, the Stasi, had its informers everywhere. Many churches were closed. Censorship prevailed. But East Germany was unable to stop people deserting to the west. Travel to the British, American and French sectors of Berlin was open to East Germans. Thousands simply packed their bags and left.
The flow of East German refugees to sanctuary in the western sector of Berlin reaches record proportions with news of the death of Stalin. Conditions are none too comfortable for these people, but they are happy to be beyond the reach of the Reds.
Undeterred, Ulbricht demanded renewed loyalty from East Germans. Alarmed, the new leaders in the Kremlin ordered Ulbricht to soften his rigid policies. He complied only half-heartedly. The hated production quotas remained in place.
If you were timed with a stopwatch to make a screw, and it took you 4 minutes, you are now expected to do it in 2.5. That was the shocking thing, this raise in work quotas and the pressure to produce. It was all too much for working people.
Popular anger exploded. Workers took to the streets of East Berlin.
When we passed construction sites, everybody, metalworkers, locksmiths, masons, carpenters, all joined us. When we arrived at the city hospital, there were several thousand people with us. Banners appeared at the construction site saying, "Down with the work quota increases."
News of the growing unrest soon spread to West Berlin.
I was having lunch in an open-air restaurant in West Berlin on the 16th of June, when a friend of mine, who was in military government and probably in intelligence, drove past and said to me, "Charles, you ought to be in East Berlin." So I got into my car and I went over and ran into the building workers who by that time had left the building sites, were on strike and were marching through East Berlin. And where I caught up with them was near the Friedrichstraße Bahnhof station, the main station right in the middle of East Berlin. And by that time, striking in itself was a political act, was an act of rebellion. But marching through the streets was something more, was almost kicking off a revolution.
Strikes and mass demonstrations erupted in East Berlin and throughout East Germany. Demonstrators tore down the symbol of Soviet domination, the hammer and sickle. Government authority in East Berlin collapsed. The senior East German communist, Karl Schördewan, was horrified.
Ulbricht, Gretewol, Hanstadt and a few others were all inside the Soviet headquarters at Karlshorst. They just sat there and talked among themselves, but nobody made any decisions. Nobody called for a meeting of the Central Committee. I thought the party was leaderless.
The demonstrators vented their anger on all visible reminders of communist rule. The Soviet authorities were astonished that Ulbricht had allowed the crisis to get out of control.
When Ulbricht arrived at the Soviet headquarters at Karlshorst, he telephoned Karl Schördewan and asked him what was going on. Schördewan reported that there were a lot of drunks in the crowd and they were smashing the windows and were about to break in. Ulbricht put the phone down and said in German, "It's all over." He said it in a way which, in Russian, roughly translates as, "It's the end." I wondered, what did it all mean? Even if they smash the windows, they have no weapons. It will take us no more than 5 minutes to sort them out.
They were trying to elect a strike committee from the leaders of the workers, when 4 Russian tanks drove into the square, 4 abreast, and went straight for the crowd. And I remember one man got caught and was run over by a tank.
Russische Panzer stoßen vor. Werkzeuge der Gewalt gegen die Freiheit. Mit dem Mut Verzweifelter gehen die Arbeiter mit Eisenstangen und Steinen auf die Panzer los. Der Ruf nach Einheit und Freiheit erschallt noch lauter. Da peitschen die ersten Schüsse durch die Straßen.
We couldn't do anything against the tanks with our bare hands and stones. As soon as the firing started, people began to drop down, wounded or dead. The shooting broke up the demonstration. For us, the dream of freedom was over.
Soviet troops quelled the revolt throughout East Germany. At least 40 people were killed and thousands were arrested. It was the first time that East German and Soviet troops closed off the Soviet sector of Berlin from the rest of the city.
The British, the Americans and the French were all for a quiet life. Their concern was to have security of the access routes to West Berlin, that they wouldn't get into difficulties with the Russians. That was all they were interested in. They did not want to get involved.
With the situation stabilized, East Germany's rulers set off for Moscow. Outside of the Soviet bloc, few countries recognized Ulbricht's German Democratic Republic. In the Kremlin, the ubiquitous Molotov signed another agreement with the Germans. Stalin's old cronies, Malenkov, Voroshilov, Khrushchev, Bulganin, Mikoyan, and Kaganovich decided to stick with Ulbricht. Carefully orchestrated for the cameras, the Politburo bid farewell and good fortune to their East German comrades. One person was missing, Stalin's secret police chief, Lavrenti Beria. The Kremlin claimed he spied for the West. Later that year, he was executed. In September 1953, Konrad Adenauer was re-elected as West Germany's chancellor. Adenauer wanted his half of Germany to become a partner in NATO, the West's military alliance.
We wanted a strong NATO as a defensive barrier against the Soviet Union. We also wanted to prevent any expansion of the Soviet Union into Western Europe. We could only achieve these aims if we had a West German army.
With American backing, Adenauer persuaded Britain and France to let their former wartime enemy into NATO. In 1955, West Germany was allowed to form an army. The Soviets quickly countered West Germany's admission into NATO by forming their own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The pact formally bound the armies of the communist satellites to the Soviet High Command. The new treaty legitimized the presence of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. Both East and West claimed their alliances were defensive. Both prepared for war. But the Soviets wanted to reduce tension in Europe. Molotov, the Kremlin's hardline foreign minister, was ordered to negotiate an Austrian peace treaty and the withdrawal of Soviet troops.
Only Molotov spoke against it. The others were more restrained. He said, why should we withdraw? We're very comfortable there. That was his position. But most of the Soviet leaders disagreed with him and thought we had to make a goodwill gesture and start talks in Europe.
In Vienna, Molotov joined John Foster Dulles and the British and French foreign ministers in signing a peace treaty.
Österreich ist frei.
Britain, France, America, and the Soviet Union agreed to end their military occupation of Austria. In return, the Austrians promised permanent neutrality. 10 years after the end of the Second World War, the West and the Soviet Union withdrew their troops. Their departure encouraged some people to hope that one day Soviet troops might also pull out of Eastern Europe. In the Kremlin power struggle, Khrushchev had outmaneuvered Malenkov and Molotov. In 1955, he led a Soviet delegation to Yugoslavia. Khrushchev wanted to repair the damage Stalin had caused by expelling President Tito's Yugoslavia from the communist bloc.
My father, he told that these people fought against fascism. And really, it is only one country in the Europe who won itself, not by the help of the Soviet Union, itself. So he told, I have to go there, not invite Tito in Soviet Union, because we are a big country, and we have to show them that we were wrong.
Tito's Yugoslavia remained the only communist country in Europe independent of the Kremlin. Inside the Soviet Union, Khrushchev wanted to overcome the legacy of Stalinist terror and hardship. He put more resources into the production of consumer goods and housing. Thousands of political prisoners had been freed from the Gulag.
My father was a strong believer in the communism. For him it was the best life to the people. It is like the heaven of the earth. And he many times repeat that it is impossible to live in the heaven surrounded by the barbed wires.
Khrushchev used the 20th Soviet Party Congress to end the hero worship of Stalin and expose the cruelties of his dictatorship. During a secret session, Khrushchev made a speech that astounded everyone present.
When he made his speech, people in the hall started to groan. There were shouts of shame.
Stalin, Khrushchev told his audience, had ordered the imprisonment and execution of thousands of loyal communists, workers, managers, and soldiers. No one, peasant or general, had been safe from Stalin's terror.
Khrushchev himself wasn't without guilt. He had played an active part in Stalin's repressions in Ukraine and in other parts of the country. He had no moral right to speak about Stalin as if he himself was pure.
He did not say anything new for me, or for the majority of my friends. He did not say everything that needed to be said, but we were happy that at least it was said. He said it in a half-whisper, literally in secret. It was not printed in the newspapers, but came out in a leaflet read at party meetings, and sometimes outside. We used to say, this is the beginning of truth. Truth will win.
This fear, this tormenting fear after Stalin's death began to fade away. After the 20th Congress, it looked as if this fear would never return.
Khrushchev's secret speech was perfect propaganda for the American-financed Radio Free Europe. The text of Khrushchev's speech was broadcast after the CIA received a copy from the Israeli intelligence service.
They were just repeating for 24 hours, 1 hour speech, over and over and over again. And this was to the party people who were brainwashed, were led to believe, and they did believe, that Stalin is God, that he couldn't make any mistake. Everything he did was infallible. Suddenly, their faith, their religion collapsed.
Poland was fertile territory for Radio Free Europe's message. Stalinist policies had brought Polish workers close to revolt. After years of shortages and hard work, they wanted change. In June 1956, workers in Poznan demanded bread, liberty, and freedom for the Roman Catholic Church, and above all, an end to the Soviet domination of Poland. The demonstrators were met with Polish tanks and Polish bullets. 74 people were killed. Young protesters faced a show trial to which foreign journalists were invited.
What really shocked the government, the regime, was that it was the workers who rose. It was not the people that they were afraid of. It was not the sort of intellectuals. It was not people involved in politics. It was real workers, and they were disgusted. So that was a terrible blow to the regime.
The uprising in Poznan fueled the spirit of rebellion. Backed by Polish workers, reformers in the Communist Party made ever more radical demands. Some even called for the withdrawal of Soviet troops. The reformers turned to Władysław Gomulka, a patriotic communist imprisoned under Stalin. Without consulting the Kremlin, Polish communists chose him as their new leader. Fearful of an anti-Russian revolt, Moscow ordered Soviet troops to advance on Warsaw, and Khrushchev flew to Poland to teach Gomulka who was boss.
We were both horrified and amused because he behaved in a very strange way. He was running around and shaking his fist. He accused us of wanting to break away and said they wouldn't allow it. He was behaving very badly.
While Gomulka and Khrushchev argued, Soviet troops positioned themselves, ready to strike. America looked on.
You're about to see the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, face the nation with questions from veteran correspondents representing the nation's press.
On the 17th of June 1953, Mr. Secretary, the people of East Germany rose against the communist regime, and the Russians were able to come in and suppress the uprising by means of armed force. We, at that time, sat back and allowed this to happen. Would we sit back again in a similar fashion if this kind of uprising were to take place in Poland?
Well, I do not think that we would send our own armed forces into Poland or into East Germany under those circumstances. I doubt if that would be a profitable or desirable thing to do. It would be the last thing in the world that these people who are trying to win their independence would want. That would precipitate a full-scale world war, and probably the result of that would be all these people be wiped out.
Because he had the backing of the Polish army and the Polish people, Gomulka won his argument with Khrushchev. Gomulka promised that Poland would remain a loyal member of the Warsaw Pact. In return, he secured greater freedom of action in Polish domestic affairs. As Soviet troops were ordered back to barracks, Gomulka addressed the people.
W ciągu ubiegłych lat nagromadziło się w życiu Polski wiele zła, wiele nieprawości i bolesnych rozczarowań. Idee socjalizmu, przeniknięte duchem wolności człowieka i poszanowania praw obywatela, w praktyce ulegały głębokim wypaczeniom. Słowa nie znajdowały pokrycia w rzeczywistości.
Gomulka's promise of a freer, more Polish nation calmed the demonstrators.
Gomulka mi opowiadał, że parę lat potem
Gomulka told me a few years later that he had a conversation with Soviet Marshal Zhukov, who had been drinking.
siedział obok Gomulki i
Zhukov said, "We were so well prepared that we could have been all over Poland in 3 days. We had very detailed plans."
Myśmy byli tak przygotowani, że w ciągu 3 dni byśmy wszystko u was opanowali.
And Gomulka replied, "Did you plan how many people on both sides would have perished?"
Również ile będzie ofiar po obu stronach.
Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin zászlaja alatt előre a béke a népek szabadságának szent ügyéért.
After Stalin's death, Hungary had remained under the ruthless dictatorship of Matyas Rákosi.
It was a saying at that time, it was like a joke. There's only 3 kinds of people in Hungary: who was in jail, who is in jail, and who will be in jail for political reasons.
Like Stalin, Rákosi killed and imprisoned his rivals, but people were expected to cheer and conform. The new Kremlin leadership disapproved of Rákosi. A senior Soviet official was sent to deal with him.
2 hét múlva jött Mikoyan, az őrmű.
Mikoyan, the Armenian wheeler dealer, arrived.
Rákosival mentünk ki Rákosért.
Rákosi and I went to meet him at the airport and took him back by car.
És hoztuk be Mikoyan. Már majdnem beértünk.
We were almost at the guest house when Mikoyan turned to Rákosi and said, "The Soviet leadership has decided you are ill."
Úgy döntött, hogy maga
Well, Rákosi didn't think he was ill. But of course, in those days, illness was a political decision. Mikoyan continued, "You will need treatment in Moscow, so you will have to resign."
The Soviets allowed Andras Hegedus to remain prime minister, but reformers in the Hungarian Communist Party sought a leader more independent from Moscow. They wanted Imre Nagy to take over. Like Gomulka in Poland, Nagy was seen as a leader who would reform the party. The Soviet embassy in Budapest was uneasy.
Ambassador Andropov sensed the possible danger and warned Moscow. He sent a lot of telegrams, he made phone calls, and even went to Moscow himself. He tried to warn everybody, but it was all in vain. Khrushchev thought he could cope with the situation.
Inspired by Gomulka's success in Poland, thousands poured into the streets of Budapest. Students and workers demanded free speech, the disbanding of the secret police, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. They paraded Hungarian flags with the communist emblem torn out.
I was stopped halfway across Margit Bridge by women students. One of them asked me for my army cap. She pinned the Hungarian national colours to it and thrust a leaflet into my hand. It contained 14 demands. I could agree with 13 of these demands, but I couldn't agree with the 14th, which called for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary. This was a demand which we couldn't possibly achieve.
The demonstrators carried portraits of Imre Nagy. Communist reformers urged him to take charge.
Imre Nagy was suddenly taken from his home to the parliament, and he had spoke of some minutes. He began saying, "Comrades," and then the crowd roared and said, "We are not comrades."
Nagy had misjudged the popular mood. Hungarians wanted immediate and radical change. In the center of Budapest, an excited crowd toppled the monument to Stalin. Nagy stayed silent when Hungary's tottering communist leadership called on the Kremlin to crush the growing unrest.
I got a telephone call from my divisional commander in Segled. He told me, "You've got to go to Budapest. It's urgent." I asked, "What are my orders?" I was told that orders would be given when I arrived in the city. We were approaching the city as dusk fell. We thought that all that was needed was a show of force. Then I heard a machine gun open fire and the screams of a man who was wounded or dying. Then I realized that things were going to get serious.
Armed civilians had prevented Soviet tank reinforcements from entering Budapest. The Hungarians had equipped themselves with Molotov cocktails, rifles, machine guns, and enthusiasm.
I don't know how the guns work, but one older man, his name was Pistobachi, he says, "Don't worry about it, I'm gonna teach you." And then I looked at the gun was bigger than me. They explained to me and showed me a couple of times. And the very first time I had to use it, I closed my eyes because, you know, for scared. I never used gun before. So then I looked around and there was a couple soldiers there. And they teared up from the uniform, they had stars for the Russian stars, so they teared it off. And they said, "Don't worry about little girl, we take care of you."
Quite a few times I wanted to go home. Maybe the next bullet is going to be mine. And I started to go. And when I saw the 14, 15-year-old kids dead, I said, I was in the service for 2.25 years. I know how to handle a gun. And I'm going home, and I'm going to leave these kids to die for our country. The shame kept me there.
During 4 days of fighting, the Budapest revolutionaries stood their ground. There were heavy losses on both sides. Imre Nagy arranged a ceasefire. The Soviets agreed to withdraw their troops from Budapest. The Kremlin hoped Nagy, now Prime Minister, could restore communist authority. But the patriot in Nagy was taking over. Cautiously, he decided to back the Hungarian revolutionaries.
Magyarország népe a múlt héten tragikus gyorsasággal törekstek a véres eseményekre. Az is vitathatatlan, hogy ezekben a megmozdulásokban elemi erővel bontakozott ki egy nagy, egész népünket átfogó és egyéforrasztó nemzeti demokratikus mozgalom.
A Nagy Imrét én megmondom önnek őszintén.
I'll tell you quite honestly, and this is not only my opinion, this is what every revolutionary thinks, at least the ones who dare express their opinions.
Nagy Imrét mi csak akkor.
We only recognized Imre Nagy as our prime minister when he actually acknowledged the revolution.
Amikor ő fölvállalta. És nem azt mondta.
He announced, this is not a counter-revolution, this is a fight for freedom.
Forradalom van, hanem azt mondta, hogy ez szabadságharc.
During the fighting in Budapest, many people had taken refuge in cellars. As they emerged, they found much of their city in ruins. The Hungarians thought they had won their revolution. They came out to mourn their dead heroes. Western correspondents flocked to Hungary to report on a victory.
What do you hope will happen now?
We hope that our country will be entirely free and we can work and we can have free connections with West.
People were enormously optimistic that life had changed. Everywhere in the country, the Hungarian tricolour was flying with the middle torn out, the communist emblem torn out. It seemed to be, a completely liberated country.
Many Hungarians looked to America and the West to guarantee their revolution.
Behind me is the Blue Danube in Budapest. The scene is calm enough here, but the rest of this city is in a bloody turmoil. For more than a week, the Hungarian rebels have been attacking the signs of Soviet tyranny. It's become a platitude to say of a people that they've earned their freedom. But it's the only thing that can really be said of the Hungarians today. Whether they will be free is still in the issue. But if sheer guts can win freedom, they'll win.
The West's attention was diverted by another crisis far from Europe. An extraordinary military venture was beginning in the Middle East. Egypt's Suez Canal was attacked by Britain, France, and Israel. America hadn't been consulted and was infuriated. So too were Hungarians.
We went to interview the head of the resistance in Győr, which is the main town in Western Hungary. And he gave us an interview. And then he said, you have wrecked, you the British, and of course the French, have wrecked our rising by starting a war in the Middle East. This will put the Russians in a position where they can in fact act with impunity because the world's eyes will be on the Middle East and not on Hungary. So they were angry.
With the Soviet army no longer in the city, the revolutionaries in Budapest took revenge. Communist Party offices were destroyed. The red flag burned. Secret policemen were strung up.
With Imre Nagy in power, there was an orgy of bloodletting in the streets of Budapest and other cities. I saw people being strung up by their feet, people being publicly humiliated and trampled on.
The Soviets sent more troops into Hungary. Prime Minister Nagy tried one last gamble. With Austria in mind, Nagy declared Hungarian neutrality and divorce from the Warsaw Pact. He hoped international pressure would stop the Soviets crushing the revolution.
Imre Nagy's government was not a legitimate one. Therefore, any decision it took concerning the Warsaw Pact, which Hungary had joined according to its own laws, was, to put it mildly, invalid.
Other communist states, especially China, were urging Khrushchev to use force.
It was a very complicated decision to my father, as he told for 3 or 4 days he talked with the Chinese, with other representatives, and one time they decided not to use force, then they told, no, we have to use force, yes, no, yes, no. At last it was decision, yes, to use it.
We were told to get ready to re-enter Budapest because the terror had started. We were not a force of occupation. Instead, we were going in as saviors to protect the people from banditry and terrorism. We knew that the Americans might also enter the city from the west. We asked our divisional commander, could this mean war? He said, yes. This could be the beginning of World War III.
On November the 4th, 1956, the Soviet army re-entered Budapest.
I called up Imre Nagy and I then told that, Mr. Prime Minister, all the signs we observed, the massive troop employment, the unrestricted shooting, now the attack against the final perimeter of Budapest, all of this suggests to me that we are in war with the Soviet Union. I recommend that U.S. Prime Minister state for the nation, for the world, that Hungary is in war with the Soviet Union due to the Soviet aggression. He dressed me down practically. No war with the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev had ordered the attack after the Americans had let him understand that as far as Eisenhower was concerned, Hungary belonged in the Soviet sphere of influence. Too late, Imre Nagy appealed to the world.
Nagy hírre beszél a Magyar Népköztársaság minisztertanácsának elnöke. Ma hajnalban a szovjet csapatok támadást indítottak fővárosunk ellen, azzal a nyilvánvaló szándékkal, hogy megdöntsék a törvényes magyar demokratikus kormányt.
The Hungarian fighters waited in vain for Western help.
And the fact that if the West intervened, it ran the high risk of generating a world war, really meant that we didn't want to see physical uprisings. And the policy, at least, was don't create any hopes on the part of the satellite countries that we will intervene.
Radio Free Europe, and they were saying, hang on to 3 weeks, 3 more weeks. We come in, we help you. So we fight for the last bullet, the last drop of blood we was holding on to. And what happened was, they was lying to us. Nobody came.
The Hungarian Revolution was crushed. Thousands were killed in the fighting. Imre Nagy was executed. "200,000 Hungarians fled into Austria before the frontier was sealed by Soviet troops. The millions who stayed behind in Hungary were prisoners. Khrushchev had reinforced the Iron Curtain. Under the direct orders of Stalin, Igor Kurchatov, a brilliant physicist known as the Beard, led the Soviet A-bomb team. They were determined to end the atomic monopoly America had held since the war. On the 29th of August 1949, they succeeded.
The shockwave approached and knocked on the roof of the bunker. 1, 2. As if a genie freed by us from the bottle patted us and thanked us for releasing him from his long captivity.
The nuclear arms race had begun. America readies itself for a nuclear attack.
Times Square is its normal busy self in the last seconds before a daylight atom bomb drill. The siren's wail sends New York's inhabitants to shelter. All buses, taxis, and autos discharge their passengers, who are guided by wardens to shelters. Movement is rapid but orderly. Housewives draw shades and turn off gas before proceeding to shelter zones in their own buildings. New York's subways provide most of the public shelters. Times Square is deserted 2 minutes after the alert.
The speed with which the Soviets had produced an atomic bomb astonished America.
I think what surprised us was that, considering the devastation which had taken place in the Soviet Union as a result of World War II, we didn't think they would be able to amass the necessary infrastructure to develop the bomb, but they certainly did, and they clearly were in our knicker, so to speak. More and more we learned how well they had infiltrated the whole Manhattan Project.
Some scientists working on America's first A-bomb, the Manhattan Project, believed that America should not have a monopoly on nuclear weapons. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born British citizen, was one.
People used him as a babysitter. He was a very polite, very quiet individual. No idea at all that he had this dual personality or this dual endeavor.
In January 1950, Fuchs was arrested in London and charged with passing atomic bomb designs to the Soviet Union. He was sentenced to 14 years for espionage.
KGB agents believed that they brought over all the drawings, and the scientists simply copied the information they brought back. Scientists say the intelligence data was very important. The engineers were less enthusiastic. They said, so what if we had the information? How to make it, how to use it, that was not clear.
The United States looked to its scientists to regain the lead. At the Los Alamos nuclear laboratories, they planned the hydrogen bomb.
We thought at that time of atomic bombs as being limited in yield to approximately the yield that had been used in the war in Japan. Whereas we thought of hydrogen bombs as being absolutely unlimited in what the yield could be. And more specifically, we thought of the hydrogen bombs as being 1,000 times as big as atomic bombs, just as atomic bombs had been 1,000 times bigger than the chemical bombs used in World War II.
This enormous destructive power shocked Robert Oppenheimer, former leader of the Manhattan Project. He and several of his colleagues argued that such weapons put the whole world at risk.
If there's another world war, this civilization may go under. We need to ask ourselves whether we're doing everything we can to avert that.
America feared that if it didn't build an H-bomb, the Russians would. President Truman gave the go-ahead. The Pacific atoll of Eniwetok was chosen to be the site of the world's first thermonuclear explosion. By 1952, Operation Ivy was ready. It required a huge refrigeration system, weighed over 82 tons, and was 20 feet high.
In less than a minute, you will see the most powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes. The blast will come out of the horizon just about there. And this is the significance of the moment. This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era. For the sake of all of us, and for the sake of our country, I know that you join me in wishing this expedition well.
It is now 30 seconds to 0 time. Put on goggles or turn away. Do not remove goggles or face burst until 10 seconds after the first light.
Minus 10 seconds. 9er, 8, 7, 6, 5er, 4, 3, 2, 1, T0.
On November the 1st, 1952, the world's first hydrogen bomb exploded with a force equivalent to over 10 million tons of TNT. 1,000 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima.
You don't know what heat is until you've seen the heat from a 10 megaton hydrogen bomb. It doesn't stop. It just gets hotter and hotter, and you start to really worry, even though you're 20-some miles away. And of course, the whole island disappeared too, which was subsequently very impressive. And the whole lagoon was just sort of a milky white. And then we were asked to go collect samples, so we got in a little motorboat with buckets and went charging into the crater, scooping up the radioactive material and taking it back for the chemists to analyze so we could determine the yield. But we were young and it was a lot of fun.
While America was developing the hydrogen bomb, a conventional war had broken out in Asia.
Korea is a small country,
thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. The fact that communist forces have invaded Korea is a warning that there may be similar acts of aggression in other parts of the world.
Congress approved a $40 billion increase in the defense budget. Truman, reluctant to use nuclear weapons again in Asia, fought the communists in Korea with conventional weapons. In 1952, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied Commander, campaigned to succeed Truman. Ike was determined not to get caught in any more conventional wars. Better, he thought, to threaten the use of America's growing nuclear arsenal to deter its enemies. Besides, you got more bang for your buck. Moscow was warned that any further aggression could involve massive retaliation. By 1954, Russia was changing. Stalin was dead, and a struggle for power was taking place between Nikita Khrushchev and Georgy Malenkov.
Malenkov said, "We have to warn our people and all of humanity that nuclear war threatens everyone with annihilation. It has to be avoided at all costs." But Khrushchev saw this as an attempt to disarm and weaken the Soviet people.
Later that year, the Soviet leadership witnessed a demonstration of their nuclear power.
Атомная бомба сброшена.
A 20-kiloton atomic bomb was dropped in the middle of a military exercise in Totskoye in the Urals.
Внимание! Идет ударная волна.
As the bomb exploded, troops were sent in to storm the radiated area. The Red Army was getting ready for nuclear war.
I was a member of the assessment team for that exercise. I remember very well how Marshal Bulganin, the Minister of Defense, stated that nuclear weapons were not as frightening as we had been warned by the imperialists.
American tests in the Pacific continued. In 1954, shrimp was expected to explode with a force of about 5 megatons, but the calculations were wrong. Winds spread radioactive fallout much further than expected.
We had not been prepared to have such a high yield, so the fallout area was much larger. And unfortunately, there was a Japanese fishing vessel, I think called the Lucky Dragon, where some of this fallout came down on them. And they had no information as to what this was. They were a long ways away. And before any information got to them or they were detected, some of the people did suffer some radiation effects.
The fishermen had been over 80 miles away when they were caught in a cloud of radioactive dust. Once again, the Japanese have been poisoned by ashes of death, reported one Tokyo newspaper. All 23 crewmen fell ill. One died.
I thought it was unfortunate that human beings had been affected, but people get hurt in all sorts of things all the time. I don't see why the public reaction was quite so strong, although the media has a tremendous effect on the public reaction.
But it wasn't just the media. A former Los Alamos scientist was worried too.
I came to the conclusion that the bomb was a very dirty bomb. And then came a statement from the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States to say, don't worry about this fallout. It's no more than you get from a chest X-ray. Now, I happen to know how much you get from a chest X-ray, and I became very much alarmed.
Several of the world's leading scientists shared this concern. With British philosopher Bertrand Russell, they put their names to a manifesto.
There lies before us, if we choose, continual progress in happiness, knowledge, and wisdom. shall we instead choose death, because we cannot forget our quarrels? We appeal as human beings to human beings. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. If you can do so, the way lies open to a new paradise. If you cannot, there lies before you the risk of universal death.
In 1955, Russia dropped the world's first airborne H-bomb.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered.
Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck.
We would get under our desks and stay there until we were told to come out. Or in some cases, in some of the classrooms, we had coat rooms off to the side of each classroom, and we'd walk through and we'd get our coat and we'd go out into the hallways and we would literally duck down facing against the wall.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash?
In that way, we thought we were protecting ourselves from the bombs and from any damage that would be done to us. We felt totally secure and protected. Bomb shelters, building bomb shelters in the backyard. It was certainly something we saw a lot in magazines and this connotation that this was happening somewhere in suburbia USA. I do remember thinking of places in our homes where these enemy people, these Russians, would never ever find us, and we would again be, of course, very safe forever.
В 50-е годы, конечно, у нас...
In the 1950s, it didn't even cross our minds that the Americans were frightened of a Soviet invasion. We thought they knew we only had peaceful aims, that all we wanted was to live in peace. We wanted to rebuild our country. We had our 5-year plans. Nowhere was it written that we wanted to invade anybody. We thought that we had something to be frightened of, because they were capitalists, and that was something terrible for us. We believed that they sucked the blood of the workers. It didn't even cross our minds that the Americans were scared of us.
In the summer of 1955, the major powers convened in Geneva. The Russian delegation was led by Marshal Bulganin and Nikita Khrushchev. Eisenhower's most striking proposal was open skies. Ike claimed his plan would ease mutual suspicion, but it would also prise open the secrecy of the Soviet military machine.
Open skies involve both the freedom to overfly each other and observe, photograph and observe what was happening, and second, an exchange of blueprints, as Eisenhower termed it, of the military programs on both sides. We broke up for tea shortly after that, and as we were standing there, Khrushchev came walking up to Eisenhower, sidling up in his way of walking, and said, "Nyet, nyet, nyet, you're simply trying to look into our bedrooms." And as we were riding back, Eisenhower said, "Now we know who's in charge of the Soviet delegation."
Later that year at the Moscow Air Show, the Soviets allowed the West to see their new jet bombers, codenamed Bison. Significantly, overhead flew 10 long-range Tu-95s, capable of delivering a nuclear bomb all the way to America.
For the Americans, seeing 10 planes capable of reaching the United States was a shock.
На территории Соединенных Штатов Америки, естественно, было шоком. До этого считалось, что
At that time,
баллистических ракет еще не было.
in the absence of ballistic missiles, they supposed that the Soviet Union didn't have any means of delivery to America.
США Советский Союз не имеет.
In response to fears of a bomber gap, Ike doubled the rate of B-52 bomber production. America needed to find out how much of a gap there really was. In California, the Raps were coming off a secret photographic reconnaissance plane. It was designed to fly at 70,000 feet, out of range of fighter planes and anti-aircraft missiles. The U-2. Controlled by the CIA, these long flights across Soviet territory posed obvious risks, but the information they might bring would be vital. Ike took the gamble.
One of the flights I was on, I came across the Saratov Engels airfield, and much to my surprise and joy, it was loaded with Bison bombers. I knew right then that I had found that there was a bomber gap, that this had to be the most important picture ever taken by a reconnaissance pilot. I just, I kind of expected Congressional Medals of Honor when I landed. However, it turned out that what I'd taken a picture of was not just a portion of the entire Russian Air Force bomber fleet, but in fact I'd taken a picture of the entire Russian bomber fleet, and there really was no bomber gap. They were all on that airfield at the same time.
Khrushchev, around that period, came to the conclusion that missiles were the weapons of the future, and that warships were getting obsolete, bombers were getting obsolete, that we should concentrate everything on missiles, and as he said somewhere, that we are on the point of producing missiles like sausages.
Engineers from all over the Soviet Union had been arriving in the harsh Kazakhstan desert to build the top-secret rocket base of Baikonur. On the 15th of May 1957, they began testing the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM.
We were kept in such strict secrecy that we couldn't mention the word missile, even between ourselves. It was called the mechanism, the product. We called it our dear one. That romanticism, it helped us to live, to keep going.
Building missiles was just one step. The next would surprise the whole world. On October the 4th, 1957, Russia launched the world's first space satellite. They called it Sputnik, traveling companion to the Earth. Americans took for granted that theirs was the richest and most technically advanced nation in the world. With Sputnik now orbiting the Earth, all that changed. Russia had won the opening event of the space race. Everywhere, eyes and ears turned to the sky.
I did have a World War II surplus piece of equipment out in our garage that had been out there for some time unused. It was too heavy to bring into the house. So I powered that thing up and tuned one of the channels to just above 20 megahertz in frequency. And there faintly in the very distant background, among all the noise and other things, I could hear this little chirping sound, more like a cricket chirping than it was a beep, if you will. To me, it was the confirmation of the fact that the Russians had indeed put a satellite into orbit, and sitting there listening to that signal and watching the booster go overhead, you couldn't help but get goosebumps thinking about that thing.
Sputnik came as a shock overseas. The American military and others realized that the period when they were out of reach had ended. A new era had begun when instead of a Sputnik, a nuclear weapon could not merely circle the Earth, but land where it was ordered to.
It had given our people quite a jolt, almost of panic proportions, to think that the Soviets could do that, and that meant they could hit the United States with missiles. Well, Eisenhower had been thinking about that for years, and this was no news to him.
Our satellite program has never been conducted as a race with other nations. Rather, it has been carefully scheduled as part of the scientific work of the International Geophysical Year. I consider our country's satellite program to be well designed and properly scheduled to achieve the scientific purposes for which it was initiated.
Eisenhower's critics charged that his lethargy had given away an advantage.
This government needs to start telling the truth to the American people. Quit kidding ourselves and quit trying to fool our friends and our neighbors. And by that I mean, let's find out just where we stand in this race and this armament picture, and let's find out just what we're going to do about it. Let's quit acting as if nothing happened, because something has happened, and it has embarrassed us throughout the world.
The world's mass media was choking with excitement that man had now entered into space. We would like to have had some rest. But one must give credit to Khrushchev. He realized that space victories could be of greater importance in politics than the threat of a club with a nuclear bomb on its end.
Within a month, Russia was ready with Sputnik 2. This time, it carried a passenger, Laika, the dog. American public opinion was split between fear of Soviet missiles and worries about the safety of the dog they called Curly.
We can only pray in this time of aloneness and suffering for Curly that God will be merciful and speed the end. This voiceless cry of mercy as this satellite spans the earth should be long remembered as a symbol of the torture the animal world must go through. And I don't mean to be facetious at all, but something to be remembered is that there's a female up there circling Mother Earth.
To catch up with the Russians, America pushed its own satellite project forward.
The Army and the Air Force were very eager to put up a satellite. Eisenhower was dubious about their proposals and decided to call on the Navy to produce a new satellite called the Vanguard to carry this out for peaceful civilian purposes only.
And so at the sunrise hour of the launching day, the U.S. scientists realize the world is watching and waiting. Success or failure will bring equal headlines. That is one price of greatness. And the Americans who sweat this one out at Cape Canaveral know their fledgling is on the spot. After rising but a few feet, the three-stage 72-foot rocket loses its thrust. The remarkable slow-motion films tell the rest of the story.
It was a national humiliation. The world's press had a field day. Something had to be done in a hurry to restore confidence in American technology. To the rescue came a former German rocket scientist, Wernher von Braun. His team had been working on a military missile known as the Redstone. Hurriedly, the Explorer satellite was fitted to it. It worked. The race in space was between capitalism and communism, a competition the West feared Russia was winning. Russia was bursting with pride and celebrated its new scientific heroes. America, determined to catch up, turned to youth. Too few students had been taking science and engineering. Too many had followed softer courses. The National Defense Education Act was passed.
As a result, my ex-husband became an engineer, my brother became an engineer. Most of the people that I knew in my small environment went to become engineers. After they did that, they went into other things, but they were, we're all sort of conditioned to think we should definitely, this is what we need to do.
In 1959, Vice President Richard Nixon opened the American National Exhibition in Moscow. He tried to impress Khrushchev with America's advances in color television.
There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, you see, you never concede anything. Wait till you see the picture.
Khrushchev toured the United States, the first communist leader to be invited. In Hollywood, the stars turned out to entertain him. In the streets, people gave him a frostier welcome. The last few days of the visit he spent with Eisenhower at Camp David. Both said they were ready to slow down the arms race. It was difficult for Eisenhower to argue for restraint. The American people were convinced that the missile gap favored Russia. Ike was questioning how much of a gap there really was. U-2 spy planes had been searching for missiles. Few had been found.
We needed the information the U-2 was bringing back because the Russians were so secretive, the largest country in the world, with no tourists, no nothing. I mean, we needed some special means for finding out.
Pilot Gary Powers was selected for one of the longest and most dangerous spy missions ever flown. He would take off from Pakistan and fly north right across Russia. His route would take him over new and improved Soviet anti-aircraft defenses. As soon as the U-2 entered Soviet territory, Russian radar tracked its progress. MiG fighters were launched but couldn't climb high enough. The order was given to fire new S-75 missiles.
One missile was enough to shoot down the Powers plane. What we discovered first of all were the remains of the plane. And here they are behind me. The fuselage, wings, and fuel tanks.
Eisenhower was told the plane was missing and that a public statement might be needed.
I reminded him that we had a cover story that we would use, that the plane was a high-altitude weather plane and it must have been off course and so on. And so that was put out.
It is entirely possible that having a failure in the oxygen equipment, which could result in the pilot losing consciousness, the plane continued on automatic pilot for a considerable distance and accidentally violated Soviet airspace.
And the main piece of evidence, so to speak, Powers himself and his equipment. He had with him a poisoned pin and a silenced pistol.
Khrushchev sprang the trap and having us in it, said we not only have the plane, we have the pilot, and it wasn't a plane that was off course, it was on course, it was not a high-altitude weather plane, it was a spy plane, and we know all of that, and demanded an apology from the United States.
It appears that endeavoring to obtain information, now concealed behind the Iron Curtain, a flight over Soviet territory was probably undertaken by an unarmed civilian U-2 plane.
Khrushchev gathered us around him, and he said, look, we're going to take a very tough position because otherwise our public simply will not understand. We'll have to make a statement saying that the president should apologize, should punish those responsible for those flights, and should say that they will not be repeated any longer.
2 weeks after the shoot-down, at the long-awaited Paris summit, Khrushchev, furious that Eisenhower wouldn't apologize, stormed out. The summit collapsed. In Moscow, Powers' trial for spying was a major media event. The world saw America caught in the act.
I ask the court to weigh all the evidence and take into consideration not only the fact that I committed the crime, but also the circumstances which led me to do so.
Powers got 10 years imprisonment. Khrushchev feared the U-2 flights had exposed his claims of missile superiority as bluff. At the secret Baikonur Cosmodrome, engineers were testing a new ICBM. In charge was Marshal Nadilin.
There was a rush to create a new missile. Orders are orders. Everybody worked on orders. Particularly as Nadelin kept a close eye on this work. He stayed there for a whole month watching the work. He just sat on a fold-up chair in front of the rocket and kept hurrying people. Quicker, quicker.
As a control panel was being fitted, the engine ignited.
People were licked by a tongue of flame. People fell like burning torches from the top of the rocket. Those close to the rocket died in no time at all. There was virtually nothing left.
189 people died.
When people from our department went to help, all they could find of Marshal Nadelin was his Marshal's star.
In America, the missile program was at last in top gear. Eisenhower had approved an additional $12 billion for defense. Atlas, Thor, Minuteman and Polaris missiles were all successfully tested. In 1961, the bands played for a new president. Throughout his election campaign, John F. Kennedy attacked the Republicans on their weak stance on communism, and in particular for the missile gap he claimed Eisenhower had let develop. Kennedy promised that his defense experts would sort out the problem.
I hardly knew the difference between a nuclear weapon and a conventional weapon. But my introduction and indoctrination was swift because a major element of the election campaign that President Kennedy had just won was the charge by the Democrats, including President Kennedy, that Eisenhower had left a missile gap, that the Soviets had been permitted by inaction on the part of the U.S. to build up a superior nuclear missile force. So clearly my first responsibility as Secretary of Defense was to determine the degree of the gap and initiate action to close it. And it took us about 3 weeks to determine, yes, there was a gap, but the gap was in our favor.
Although behind in the missile race, Russia still had a card to play: Yuri Gagarin.
From about 5 o'clock in the morning, I kept thinking, now they're waking him up. Now he's getting dressed, being fed. Now he's getting on the bus on his way to the launch pad.
Gagarin had been chosen to be the first man in space. Behind him sat his backup man, German Titov.
For us, it was ordinary work. Well, not quite ordinary, because we had to fly rockets and Sputniks, but that's what we were prepared for.
We could see the launch very well. At first, our dear one started rocking very slightly. Then, whoosh, off it went, up into the sky. It was incredibly beautiful. particularly for us who'd given so much of themselves to the project.
Часов 7 минут по московскому времени я услышал свист и все нарастающий гул. Почувствовал, как гигантский космический корабль задрожал всем своим корпусом и медленно, очень медленно оторвался от стартового устройства. Было трудно пошевелить рукой. Я знал, что это состояние продлится недолго, пока корабль наберет необходимую скорость и выйдет на орбиту вокруг Земли. Земля сообщила: прошло 70 секунд после старта. Я ответил: понял вас, все хорошо.
Gagarin circled the Earth. The flight had lasted 108 minutes. He arrived back to a hero's welcome.
There were tears of joy. People kissed strangers in the streets. And Gagarin, he was everybody's love. He and his smile. I still keep his photograph.
His achievement delighted every Russian and the world. There's a barbed wire fence dividing a city. Imprisoning its people. The very image of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall.
Raise your right hand.
Memphis, Tennessee, March 1958.
I do solemnly swear that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the United States of America.
Give us a room with a view of the beautiful Rhine.
Elvis Presley hits West Germany.
The well-known guitarist has come to bolster NATO forces, in particular a 3rd U.S. Armored Division tank unit.
I got those 1, 2, 3, 4 occupation GI Blue.
West Germany was NATO's front line along the Iron Curtain. Since 1955, the Americans had been training a new West German army. Some thought that could mean a German finger on NATO's nuclear trigger. German rearmament brought back nightmares for many Europeans, above all for the Russians. The new weaponry alarmed East Germany, the German Democratic Republic.
Die DDR hat ja nun versucht, verschiedene Angebote zu machen, einer Nuklear...
The GDR made various offers to prevent the nuclear armament of West Germany.
vorzubeugen, aber sie hat da...
But it found no response, no echo.
Und darum fühlte sich die DDR...
The GDR felt directly threatened by tactical nuclear weapons.
taktischen Atomwaffen fühlte sich bedroht.
It accepted that the Soviet army, stationed on GDR territory, also should arm itself with tactical nuclear weapons.
Mit taktischen Atomwaffen.
Berlin, deep in East German territory, was under the joint occupation of the former wartime allies. Now in West Berlin, 12,000 British, American and French soldiers were surrounded by 500,000 Soviet and East German troops. Western rights of access were protected by four-power agreement. Each day, thousands moved freely between the Soviet and Western sectors. Berlin's open border gave East Germans access to the glittering West, which Soviet and East German leaders wanted to end.
West-Berlin immer gefährlicher wurde für die Existenz der DDR und damit auch für die Existenz des Sozialismus. Und daraus
West Berlin was becoming increasingly dangerous to the existence of the GDR and to the existence of socialism. Khrushchev proposed to create a free city of Berlin with special rights of its own. with its own foreign policy, its own police, and its own symbolic foreign forces.
Khrushchev thought that some pressures should be put on the Americans, and the obvious place was West Berlin. So that this was a sort of shock therapy on the part of Khrushchev, I would say.
In November 1958, the West rejected Khrushchev's Berlin proposals. Khrushchev now offered East German leader Walter Ulbricht a peace treaty. It threatened Western rights in Berlin.
He said that unless agreement were reached, that Berlin would be turned over to the East Germans within 6 months. We regarded that as an ultimatum. Eisenhower felt that the Soviets were doing something that was not really in their interest. His view was that if there were to be actual conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, it would move quickly to large-scale, all-out conflict where everything would be drawn into it. And that was the danger, that was the risk.
A new red threat to West Berlin. Khrushchev's demand that the United States, France, and Britain agree to end the four-power pact governing West Berlin, turning it over to Red East Germany, hints a new and major crisis. The Western powers reacted strongly, affirming their determination to keep the city free. It's an outpost.
American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, seeking common ground for a bargain over Berlin, consulted America's allies. But talks between the West and the Soviet Union led nowhere.
The attempt to find a compromise with the Soviets was where we began to get into serious trouble, because any concessions that you made to the Soviets from the Western side would be an erosion of the Western position there. And the Soviets themselves were committed to a situation in Berlin that the Allies could not tolerate. So we were already, I mean, there was no possible outcome, a negotiated outcome that was possible.
But the talks persuaded Khrushchev to shelve his Berlin ultimatum and head west. He chose the world's largest aircraft for the journey, Soviet-built. In September 1959, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev became the first Soviet leader to visit America.
Khrushchev got what he wanted, which was a visit to the United States and treatment as an equal, and an exchange with Eisenhower, which gave him, I think, a fair idea that probably if he continued without too much provocative actions on the ground, he could get more and more out of the Western side.
In talks with Eisenhower, a new spirit of cooperation eased the crisis. But Khrushchev's hopes for a Cold War truce only lasted 6 months. On the eve of a grand peacemaking summit in Paris, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down in Soviet airspace. Khrushchev was enraged.
Но для этого что требуется? Не летайте вы в Советский Союз, не летайте вы в социалистические страны. Уважайте суверенитет и знайте границу. Не знаете границу? Ударим. Ударим, обучим уму-разуму.
The summit collapsed before it had even begun. (1959). East Germany celebrated 10 years of socialist achievement. Walter Ulbricht, party leader, boasted of rapid industrial progress and of a socialist democracy that Germany had never known before. Official films portrayed a paradise for workers and peasants. The reality was shortages and chaos. Private farms were forcibly collectivized, and the state's resources poured into heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods. Obediently, East Germany copied the Soviet model, down to thought control of its people.
Und so turnten dann 400 Einwohner Leipzigs gemeinsam mit Walter Ulbricht.
East Germany, its leaders claimed, was succeeding through sheer willpower. But in spite of hard work and enthusiasm, only Soviet support kept the economy going. East Germany could not compete with the swelling prosperity of the West.
The people in the East looked toward the West with what I might say longing. They would have liked to have the same comforts, the same goods, the same chances. And they saw in what was called socialism at the time a system that demanded of them sacrifices with nothing but promises for the future. And as long as the borders were open, it was relatively easy to get there. All you had to do is board a subway, and you were in another world. And it was really a crazy system. Imagine you go from socialism, in quotation marks, to capitalism in 2 minutes.
Every month, thousands of East Germans fled across the open Berlin border and took refuge in the West. Most refugees were young and skilled. Their departure was bleeding the East German economy to death.
Foreman in a plant in the East wouldn't know how many workers he still would have the next day, because part of his working force had left him, had left the East, had left the system in order to go over there. And of course, in West Germany, they made every effort that people who came from the East would get jobs and would get comfortable existence.
As his people drained away, Ulbricht became anxious. He urged Khrushchev to recognize East Germany as a sovereign state with control over its own borders. Khrushchev, outwardly sympathetic, played for time.
Diese Idee eines separaten Friedens mit der DDR wurde mehr lanciert von Ulbricht.
The idea of a separate peace treaty with the GDR was put forward mainly by Ulbricht, who wanted to bind the GDR into fixed treaties and link it politically with other countries. But Khrushchev argued that a separate peace treaty would intensify the Cold War.
Den Kalten Krieg nicht entschärft, sondern im Gegenteil verschärft.
Ulbricht argued that there could be no lasting peace in Europe until both German states, East and West, were recognized. But Moscow was in no hurry. The German question must wait until after the American presidential election. John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961. He had campaigned for a more vigorous American foreign policy.
I don't think the communists are about to collapse. I believe we have to build strength. We have to stand for freedom. We have to demonstrate some vigor in our foreign policy.
Kennedy agreed to meet Khrushchev at Vienna in June 1961. The president arrived bruised. His invasion of Castro's Cuba at the Bay of Pigs 6 weeks before had failed. Khrushchev concluded that Kennedy was weak. He had decided to bully the new president.
He felt that this young new president, unexperienced, and specifically after he has a fiasco at Bay of Pigs, came rather with not very strong position. He said, look here, already so many years passed, Western countries do nothing about Germany and the peace treaty and about specifically West Berlin. So I am going to press this issue very strongly with the meeting with the new president.
What Khrushchev kept saying was that we surround all those troops you have in West Berlin, and we could take West Berlin anytime we want to. And Kennedy's reply to him was, well, as may be, but we fought the Second World War, and they're there because of the Second World War by right.
He became very emotional, very angry. This young fellow doesn't want to discuss with me the issue, which is very important. And this make it very angry, and really it influenced his attitude. So it's, he has a mixed feeling about. From one thing, he accepted his stuff, but from the other, he said that he is not wise enough. Doesn't understand quite well the foreign policy.
The meeting was unproductive, and the longer it went on, the more that became apparent. It was difficult. It was disappointing. It left us with a Berlin crisis that was still active and on which no progress had been made.
At the summer White House in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, Defense Secretary McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk confer with President Kennedy on the increasingly ominous words and actions from Moscow. Premier Khrushchev's increase in arms...
Khrushchev had renewed his ultimatum and increased the Soviet arms budget. Kennedy asked his advisors to list America's military options.
It was conceivable there would only be two alternatives: surrender or use of nuclear force, which might well have brought destruction of both East and West. So the president was very anxious to find a middle course.
In July, Kennedy asked Congress for extra defense funds and called reservists to arms.
The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin. For the choice of peace or war is largely theirs, not ours.
Of all the presidents in this Cold War period, I think the nuclear issue bore hardest on Kennedy. He took it very seriously, and he was sometimes afraid that the good Lord had put him on earth to start a nuclear war, really. And he was not about to get out of Berlin, no matter what it took.
It would be a mistake for others to look upon Berlin because of its location as a tempting target. The United States is there. The United Kingdom and France are there. The pledge of NATO is there. And the people of Berlin are there. It is as secure in that sense as the rest of us. So we cannot separate its safety from our own.
So he made very clear that he is going to defend status of West Berlin and the presence of their troops there. But when he mentioned this one, we noticed one thing, that in his speech he mentioned that the line between West and East Berlin are a line of freedom. And he didn't say anything about the freedom of the movement across this line, East Berlin and West Berlin.
It is a fact that we were not going to fight about what the Soviets did on their side of Berlin, and that it is quite likely that Khrushchev was helped to understand that American position by the July speech.
As the Berlin crisis darkened, the flow of refugees became a torrent. Fear rose that East Germany might collapse, pitching NATO and Soviet forces into conflict.
Everybody knew that something is going to happen. Not necessarily only from the atmosphere, but for weeks, thousands and thousands of people have come across. And everybody realized that in some way or another, East Germany will have to react.
By July, the East Germans were desperate. They begged the Soviets to let them stem the flow.
Заявление Ульбрихта в беседе с нашим послом говорило только о следующем.
Ulbricht indicated to our ambassador that they were fed up with the promises we'd given them to sign a peace treaty and take control. Promises which had been made in 1958, 59, 60, and again in 1961. Ulbricht said that all these promises did was to stimulate a population drain. Either we had to act or stop talking about it.
East German border controls were intensified. Undetected by Western intelligence, Khrushchev and Ulbricht were planning harsher measures.
Sometime later, a reply came back from Moscow. But Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev agrees to the closing of the border with West Germany and with West Berlin, and suggests the necessary preparations should be carried out.
The National People's Army, the People's Police, the Customs State Security, the Transport Authority were all brought together in the Berlin area. They were put under strict observation, and they were not allowed to telephone their families. They didn't even have a telephone. For 4 to 6 weeks, they worked in total isolation on the preparations.
On August the 12th, Soviet and East German forces were mobilized.
At 23 hours, we were given our orders and told that at 24 hours, the border with West Berlin would be closed by military force. All the soldiers were fully armed. The People's Militia had automatic pistols and machine guns, any weapons they could get hold of.
By early morning, East German troops were ready, lined up in battle order along the sector border. It was Berlin's last hour as one city. On the morning of Sunday, August 13th, Berliners woke to find a divided city. Teams of workers under armed guard started erecting a barbed wire barrier through the center.
Khrushchev, preparing to this event, would have done everything to minimize, or rather to prevent, any military conflict between us and the United States and Western countries. Specifically, Ulbricht was told by Khrushchev 2 days before this what was happening that he, Ulbricht, could build this wall, but he should not infringe even an inch of American and Western rights. So we expect very strong reaction, but we didn't expect any military clash between us.
The barrier split Berlin. Families were torn apart.
My father actually woke me up and said, you know, they closed the border. It was incomprehensible. You know, it was so strange. And then my mother came in crying, and my elder sister, and we were thinking, you know, how do we get my sister back? My sister that summer had stayed with my aunt just outside of East Berlin. So we all took the S-Bahn, and it was an absolute chaos. It was terrible. People crying, shouting. Some were frightened, some were angry. And I just remember I was so frightened. I thought, we never see my sister. She's lost, so to speak.
A pitiful old woman timidly walked up the 3 stairs to one of these trapos and said, when is the next train to West Berlin? Because all these people hadn't heard. The first news was at midnight over the East Berlin radio, and these people came to the station thinking they could go to West Berlin. And I'll never forget the sneering tone in which this trapo said to her, none of that anymore, Grandma, you're all sitting in a mousetrap now.
Die Menschen waren ganz anders, die haben zwar geschimpft auf uns.
The people were swearing at us. We felt we were simply doing our duty, but we were getting scolded from all sides.
Und wurden dann von allen 2 Seiten Westberliner beschimpft.
The West Berliners yelled at us, and the Eastern demonstrators yelled at us. We were standing there in the middle. There was the barbed wire, there were us guards, West Berliners, East Berliners. For a young person, it was terrible.
Sie bitte bis hinter das sowjetische Denkmal zurück. Sie bitte für unsere Anordnungen verständigen.
The anger of West Berliners boiled over. They demonstrated against the division of their city. They could not believe that the Western Allies would allow the barriers to remain. The demonstrations continued, but the West offered little protest. Mayor Willy Brandt tried to calm the crowds. He feared bloodshed if they attacked the barriers. The Allies were unsure how to react. Western rights had not been challenged.
Erstmal waren wir wütend. Dann waren wir enttäuscht.
We were outraged.
Der Bürgermeister hatte nicht mal geschafft,
and also disappointed.
Die Kommandanten dazu zu bewegen.
The mayor didn't manage to persuade the Allied commanders to make even a small protest.
Auszusprechen.
People were not clear what exactly was going on. It was almost 12 hours before it really registered that this was going to be a total sealing of the inner sector borders. Nobody was quite sure what to do about the subject, what exactly was the scope of it. The focus of all of the planners had been on the threat, the possible necessity of having to take military action to block a Soviet move on Berlin. And here suddenly everybody was relieved to find out that the Soviets had found a way to resolve their problem with the refugees in a way that did not affect Allied rights.
For the Allies, the closed border stabilized the tense Berlin situation. It was ordinary Berliners and their families who paid the price. In East Berlin, one soldier saw his last chance to escape.
Dann war die 14 Uhr, habe ich meine Gruppe eingeteilt.
At 2 o'clock, I assigned tasks to my soldiers. I was in front, and I spread the others out so that it wouldn't look suspicious. Nobody noticed anything. From 2 until 4 o'clock, I was thinking about the situation and wondering what was the right decision. I would have to leave my parents and my sister. Finally, I took the decision. I jumped over the barbed wire at 4 o'clock. Then I was in the West, and they received me with a great cheer. I was the first.
Der Erste.
3 days later, concrete blocks began to replace the barbed wire. Along the sector boundaries rose the Berlin Wall, carving the city in two. In West Berlin, morale was low. Confidence in Allied protection crumbled. Mayor Willy Brandt sent an angry letter to President Kennedy demanding action.
Die Idee war eben, nachdem auch in Washington nichts passierte, die ganze
The idea was, since there had been no reaction in Washington,
den Präsidenten darauf aufmerksam zu machen,
we had to make it
dass
clear
hier
to the president
psychologisch ein Einbruch
that there might be a breakdown in morale, a loss of trust.
Einbruch und dass hier
Something more than just a protest had to be done.
man mehr als Protest machen müsste.
I think it's probably putting it mildly to say he was furious. Kennedy felt that he had shown that he was prepared to go to the brink of war, maybe even over the brink of war to defend Berlin, and here he was being criticized for doing nothing by as somebody put it, a mere mayor.
But Kennedy realized that a gesture was needed, a sign that America still meant to defend West Berlin. He ordered a show of force. An American troop convoy was sent to Berlin up the Autobahn across East Germany. The plan was to test East German reaction and to reaffirm Allied access rights to Berlin. The Americans were stopped and counted. They waited and were let through. The troops arrived safely. America's Vice President Lyndon Johnson flew to the city as Kennedy's personal representative. He was accompanied by General Lucius Clay, hero of the Berlin airlift. Johnson brought a message from President Kennedy.
He wants you to know that the pledge he has given to the freedom of West Berlin and to the rights of Western access to Berlin is firm.
In the east, people risked death to flee through the last chinks in the barrier.
All of a sudden, I saw my friend running, and I said to myself, "Oh my God, you're not going to make it." And I couldn't run. I turned into a pillar of salt. And an elderly woman said to me, "Go girl, run too. You're still young, run." So I just started running. My friend had hurt her face, but I'd only ripped my sweater. Apart from that, I wasn't hurt. We were incredibly happy. We laughed and cried. We'd just made it.
Many more made an impulsive dive for freedom.
Und eines Tages kam nicht nach Hause.
One day he didn't return home. I was waiting and waiting. He didn't come during the night or the next day, and I thought, what has happened? And then my brother-in-law came. "Don't you know," he said, "he's in the West." My whole world collapsed. I had to collect his things from work. It was like collecting the belongings of a dead person.
Later, Heinz Carstens helped his wife to escape. Where the border ran down the middle of the street, windows overlooked the west. Helping people escape became a routine assignment for West Berlin's fire brigade.
nachher so, das spielte sich so ein, dass Leute springen wollten und Türme.
It became the custom that people who wanted to escape, people who wanted to leave, would throw little pieces of paper out of the windows into Bernauerstrasse.
Die Nummer, die
The number of the building, the floor, the window. Second or third window was written on it, and the time, for example 10 o'clock, that they wanted to jump.
Um 10 Uhr abends wollen wir springen.
Here are perhaps the most dramatic scenes ever to come out of Berlin. Tossing belongings from the window of an apartment overlooking the western border and freedom, an escapee is prepared to jump to safety into a net held by police and firemen of West Berlin. A rescue episode that is even more extraordinary. An attempt is being made by sympathetic Germans to assure the escape of a brave woman. While communist police try to pull her back through the window, below there is freedom's grip, a blood-chilling sequence that the News of the Day camera follows to its dramatic conclusion. She's safe at last.
The East Germans blocked even this last loophole. People swam lakes and canals, clung under trains, hid in cars, climbed barriers under fire. Hundreds failed. Many died. Despite the human suffering, East Germany justified the wall as a bulwark of peace.
When the barbed wire was put up, the main argument was that peace had been saved. It wasn't a question of domestic difficulties. Ulbricht drew a veil of silence over the economic problems. They talked always of the anti-fascist barrier. That's how it was officially described, the protective bulwark.
They did it as a necessity. And I thought, what kind of system is it that can only exist by keeping them with force in their own bailiwick. And the wall was the actual symbol of a defeat, of inferiority.
Escapes went on. Killings went on. Telephone lines were cut. Now the two cities could no longer talk. At the few Allied crossing points, tension was high. In October, an American diplomat was stopped by East German guards as he was crossing to visit the theater in East Berlin. The Americans decided to make an issue of it and assert their right to free movement in Berlin. Lucius Clay was back on the scene.
Clay's calculation was that the Soviets were responsible for East Berlin, not the East Germans, and he was determined that the Soviets would recognize their responsibility there.
To test East German reaction, Clay ordered armed American soldiers to escort vehicles back and forth across the border at Checkpoint Charlie.
He once told me, he said, I learned early in the game of dealing with the Russians, if the Russians understand one thing, and that's force, that's strength. You must never negotiate or deal with the Russians without having a position of strength.
To underline his point, Clay moved tanks up to the checkpoint. The Russians brought up their tanks and guns. The two sides faced each other barrel to barrel.
The telephone rang in a command post. He said, let me speak to General Clay. I said, he's not here. Who is this? He said, this is the military police officer at Checkpoint Charlie. He said, holy Christ, he said, the Russians have rolled in here in force. He said, they've got tanks. He said, the balloon's getting ready to go up. He said, the defecation is about to hit the fan.
The situation was dangerous. The tanks stood facing each other. Our tank crews were told to exercise restraint, to give no grounds for provocation.
The dead seriousness of it became more intense with each hour. The Western forces went on alert, Strategic Air Command went on alert, NATO went on alert, troops were being cranked up around the world, and one never knew if the intensity of the situation in Berlin escalated, where would be the next sore point.
Khrushchev ordered the commander of Soviet troops in Germany that if the West used force, they should respond with force. I had a phone by one ear receiving information from Soviet military headquarters in Germany. The other phone was connected to the Kremlin. As soon as I got the information, I reported to the Kremlin what was happening at Friedrichstrasse.
President Kennedy had sent a message to Khrushchev through a new private channel that had been established only a month earlier for a back channel between the White House and Khrushchev, and that President Kennedy had asked Khrushchev to take the first move.
The Americans sent a message. It said, in order for us to move our tanks without losing face, you should move your tanks back to a certain distance. Our tank stood 200 meters from the Americans.
The lead Soviet tank cranked up his engine and backed up some 5 or 10 meters, and we received instructions to have the American tanks to withdraw exactly the same distance.
It wasn't a good enough reason to start a war. Khrushchev himself said, we're not unleashing a third world war because of Berlin. The Americans realized that too.
The soldiers pulled back, but the wall remained. The East Germans built it higher and backed it with fences, tripwires, and tank traps. During the first year, 50 Germans died trying to cross to the west. One of them was 18-year-old Peter Fechter.
The Americans gathered, the soldiers gathered on one side, not doing anything. And on the other side, the GDR, the Vorpost, the police there, was standing on their side, not doing anything. And this young man was huddled. I remember he was lying like an S shape. And first he screamed, he cried, he shouted for help. And as the hours went on, his voice got weaker and weaker. It was so heart-rending that in the middle of nowhere was a human being dying, and two groups was facing each other, too worried to act because they didn't know what the other one was going to do. It was really horrible. You were just standing there and you thought, he's just dying and you can't do anything. I mean, I've never been in that situation before, neither after, where you actually see a person dying and you can't do anything. And I'm sure everyone else around me felt the same.
The wall was the supreme symbol of the Cold War's cruelty and Europe's division. Its message was a bitter one. Whatever happened beyond that line, the West might lament, but would not interfere.
The wall was a way out, really, for Khrushchev. And although the Berlin affair continued to be discussed, it was no longer in a state of crisis as it had been before the wall.
In 1963, President Kennedy visited West Berlin.
Freedom is indivisible. And when one man is enslaved, all are not free. When all are free, then we can look forward to that day when this city will be joined as one, and this country, and this great continent of Europe, in a peaceful and hopeful globe. When that day finally comes, as it will, the people of West Berlin can take sober satisfaction in the fact that they were in the front lines for almost 2 decades. all free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.